When I signed the hospital consent forms with my shaking hand, I believed I was signing my husband back into my life. The pen felt heavier than it should have, like it knew what it was costing me. The paper smelled faintly of disinfectant and cheap ink, and the nurse kept clearing her throat as if to remind me that time was something we didn't have. My husband lay behind the glass wall, pale and quiet, a man who had once filled every room with his voice, now reduced to shallow breaths and blinking machines. "Mrs. Caldwell?" the nurse said gently. "We just need your authorization for the procedure and the payment confirmation." Payment, such a small word for something that would empty my life. I nodded because what else does a wife do when the doctor says, without surgery, he won't make it? I nodded because 23 years of marriage had trained my body to respond before my heart could ask questions. I nodded because I still loved him then, or at least I loved the man I believed he was. I didn't know that while I was signing away my savings, my husband had already signed himself away from me. Before sickness entered our home like an uninvited guest, my life was ordinary in the quiet, respectable way. I woke up at 5 every morning, long before the sun, because I liked having the house to myself while the world was still asleep. I'd brew coffee, dark, strong, just how Martin liked it, and stand at the kitchen window watching the street lights flicker off one by one. Martin used to tease me about my routines. "You live like a clock," he'd say, tying his tie in the hallway mirror. "Same tick, same talk every day." I took it as a compliment. Clocks are dependable. Clocks don't abandon you. We lived in a modest 2-story house we bought when our daughter, Elise, was still in diapers. By the time this story began, Elise was grown and married, living 2 states away with a life too busy for weekly phone calls. The house felt larger without her laughter echoing down the stairs, but Martin filled the silence easily. He always had. He worked as a project manager at a construction firm downtown, a job that aged him faster than he liked to admit. He'd come home smelling of dust and asphalt, loosening his tie before he even closed the door. I listened to him talk while I reheated leftovers or set the table. Complaints about deadlines, coworkers who didn't pull their weight, bosses who didn't listen. Marriage for us wasn't fireworks, it was habit, comfort, the steady rhythm of shared meals and shared bills and shared years. We weren't affectionate in grand ways, but he'd reach for my hand in the grocery store, and I'd fold his laundry just the way he liked, socks paired, shirts facing the same direction. Looking back now, I wonder if comfort made me careless. The illness came quietly. Martin started coming home earlier than usual, claiming exhaustion. He stopped eating full meals, pushing food around his plate while staring at nothing. At night, I'd wake to the sound of him coughing in the bathroom, the light under the door glowing like a secret. "You should see a doctor," I told him one evening as he rinsed his mouth, avoiding my eyes in the mirror. "It's just stress," he said. "Everyone at work is dropping like flies." He said work often then, more than usual, and there was something in his voice, a tightness like a door being held shut. I didn't push. Wives learn when to push and when to wait, or at least we think we do. The day he collapsed at the office, I was folding towels, blue ones, the good set we only used when guests came over. My phone rang, and I remember being irritated at first because it interrupted my neat stacks. That irritation shames me now. "Mrs. Caldwell?" a man said. "This is St. Vincent's Medical Center. Your husband has been admitted through the ER." The world didn't tilt or spin like it does in movies. It narrowed. Everything else disappeared, the towels, the clock, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, until there was only that voice and the sound of my own breathing. The diagnosis was severe, complicated, expensive. The doctor spoke carefully, choosing words like necessary and urgent and life-saving. He explained the risks, the recovery time, the chances. "What about insurance?" I asked, already knowing the answer by the way his eyes softened. "Your coverage will help, but not nearly enough." That night, sitting alone in the hospital room while Martin slept, I stared at the ceiling tiles and did the math in my head. Our savings, my retirement fund, the small inheritance my mother left me tucked away for emergencies. This was an emergency. I told myself money could be earned again, time could not. Martin squeezed my hand weakly when I told him we'd move forward with the surgery. His eyes filled with tears, and for a moment I felt needed in a way I hadn't in years. "I don't know what I'd do without you," he whispered. Neither did I. The surgery was successful. The doctor smiled, nurses patted my arm, everyone congratulated me as if I had won something instead of barely surviving losing everything. Recovery was slow. Martin stayed home for weeks, then months. I took on extra hours at the accounting firm where I worked, coming home late with aching feet and a mind too tired to notice small changes. Like how he guarded his phone now, turning it face down whenever I entered the room, or how he suddenly had opinions about his future, plans that didn't seem to include our shared routines. "I just need some space to heal," he said when I asked why he seemed distant. "You wouldn't understand." I accepted that too, because when you've just paid for a man's life, you don't want to believe he's already planning a new one without you. I didn't know it yet, but while I was signing away my savings, my husband had already signed himself away from me. While I was counting pills and balancing budgets, Martin was counting days. And somewhere beyond the walls of our quiet house, another woman already knew his escape plan by heart. The first time I sensed something truly wrong, it came not as a scream, but as a silence. Martin had always filled space with sound. Even during his recovery, he'd narrated the television, argued with the news anchors, complained about commercials that repeated too often. So when I came home one evening to a house that felt muted, no television, no radio, no humming from the garage, I paused in the doorway longer than usual. The air smelled faintly of reheated soup and something else I couldn't place, a sweetness almost, like a perfume that didn't belong to me. "Martin," I called out, setting my purse down. "In here," he said, his voice too quick, too rehearsed. He was in the living room, sitting upright in his recliner as if he'd been there all day, a blanket folded neatly over his knees. His phone rested on the side table, screen dark, but his hand hovered close to it like a reflex. "How was work?" he asked. I studied his face as I answered. "Busy, they're short-staffed again." He nodded without really listening, his eyes drifting past me toward the hallway. I followed his gaze and saw nothing, just the closed bathroom door, the spare bedroom, shadows where our family photos hung. "You feeling okay?" I asked. "Fine," he said, too quickly, "just tired." Tired had become his favorite word. It covered everything: his impatience, his distance, his refusal to let me help with his physical therapy exercises, his sudden insistence that he didn't need me hovering. I went into the kitchen and opened the fridge. My leftovers were untouched. Instead, there was a small plastic container I didn't recognize, salad maybe, with dressing I never bought. "You have company today?" I asked lightly. "No," he said, a beat too long. "Why?" "Just asking." I threw the container away without comment, though my chest tightened as it hit the trash bag with a dull thud. That night I lay awake listening to the rhythm of his breathing beside me. He slept facing away from me now, his back like a wall. The clock on the nightstand ticked louder than usual, each second pressing into me like a question I was afraid to ask. In the morning, he announced he was going for a walk. "Doctor says I should build up my stamina," he said, tying his shoes with a care he never used to bother with. "Want me to come?" I asked. He shook his head. "I need to do this on my own." That sentence stayed with me all day. Little things began stacking up like stones in my pockets, receipts I didn't recognize, a credit card charge for a restaurant I'd never heard of, a change in his tone when he talked about work, lighter, almost excited, as if something there was giving him energy I no longer could. "She's very organized," he said one night over dinner, referring to someone at the office. "Keeps everyone on track." "She?" I asked, trying to sound uninterested. "Yeah, new hire, marketing liaison or something like that." I nodded and took a bite of food that suddenly tasted like cardboard. "Her name?" I asked. "Claire," he said, and the way his mouth shaped her name made something cold slide down my spine. I didn't confront him, not then. There was still a part of me that believed love meant patience, and patience meant silence. Instead, I paid closer attention. I noticed how he showered longer on days he said he was checking in at work, how he wore cologne again, the one I bought him years ago but he'd stopped using because he said it was too much. He smiled at his phone and then erased the smile when he caught me watching. One afternoon, while folding laundry, his phone buzzed on the bed. I glanced at it out of habit, expecting a spam call or an appointment reminder. The message preview was short. "Miss you already." My hands froze mid-fold, a shirt slipping from my fingers onto the bedspread. I didn't open the message. I didn't need to. The words sat there between us, loud and undeniable. When Martin came out of the bathroom, towel around his waist, I was still standing there, his phone in my hand. "Who misses you?" I quietly asked. He stopped short, his eyes flicking from my face to the phone. For a moment, I saw something raw in his expression, fear maybe, or annoyance. It disappeared quickly. "It's nothing," he said, "just someone from work." "Someone who misses you?" I repeated. "You're reading too much into it." "Am I?" My voice didn't rise. It felt strange how calm I was, like my body had gone into survival mode. He sighed, running a hand through his damp hair. "You're tired. Let's not do this." That night he slept on the couch, claiming his back hurt. I lay in our bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the message in my mind until it etched itself into me. "Miss you already." Already meant there had been a before. The next morning, I did something I never thought I would do. I followed him. I told my office I'd be working remotely and waited until he left the house, his jacket crisp, his step lighter than it had been in months. I followed at a distance, my hands sweating on the steering wheel. He didn't go to the office. He parked outside a small cafe on Maple Street, one I passed often but never visited. He checked his watch, adjusted his collar, and smiled. Then she arrived. Claire was younger than me, though not dramatically so. She had soft brown hair pulled into a low ponytail and wore a cream-colored sweater that made her look warm and approachable. She laughed when she saw him, touching his arm as if it belonged there. They hugged. Not the kind of hug coworkers share. I watched from my car, my heart pounding so hard I was sure it would give me away. When they went inside together, I stayed where I was, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I didn't go in. I didn't need to hear their voices or see their faces up close. What I'd already seen was enough. I drove home slowly, the world outside my windshield blurring into colors and shapes. Every memory of the last few months rearranged itself in my mind, each one now carrying a different meaning. That afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table and opened my laptop. If Martin had been planning something, I needed to know how far he'd gone, because suddenly I understood something with painful clarity. His recovery wasn't just physical, it was strategic, and whatever he was healing for, it didn't include me. There is a particular kind of dread that settles in your stomach when you stop asking if something is wrong and start asking how bad it is. That afternoon, I didn't cry, I didn't pace, I moved with a strange calm, the kind that comes when your heart is too overwhelmed to panic. I wiped the kitchen counter even though it was already clean. I fed the cat. I made tea and forgot to drink it. Then I opened our financial records. For years, I'd managed the bills. It was one of the unspoken arrangements in our marriage. Martin earned a little more, but I kept us steady. I knew where every dollar went, or at least I thought I did. I logged into our joint account first. Nothing unusual at a glance. Utilities, mortgage, groceries. But then I noticed transfers. Small at first, amounts easy to overlook if you weren't paying attention. 200 here, 300 there, always spaced out, always labeled vaguely, miscellaneous, personal, reimbursement. My throat tightened. I pulled up statements from the past 6 months, the months surrounding his illness, his surgery, his recovery. The transfers increased right after he came home from the hospital, right after I emptied my savings. I clicked through credit card records next, restaurants I'd never been to, a boutique hotel near the river, a pharmacy purchase that wasn't covered by insurance and didn't match any of his prescriptions. I stared at the screen until the numbers blurred. This wasn't an affair that happened accidentally. This was logistics, planning, quiet preparation done while I sat beside his hospital bed, counting his breaths and praying he'd wake up. When Martin came home that evening, I was sitting at the dining table with my laptop closed and a single piece of paper laid out in front of me. "What's this?" he asked, loosening his jacket. "Sit down," I said. He hesitated, then pulled out the chair across from me. He didn't look at the paper. He looked at my face. "I followed you today," I said calmly. His jaw tightened. "You what?" "I saw you with her, Claire, the cafe on Maple Street." Silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second an accusation. "It's not what you think," he said finally. I almost laughed. Almost. "Tell me what it is, then." He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms like a man preparing for a negotiation. "I didn't plan for this to happen. It just did." "When?" I asked. He looked away. "Before the surgery." The words hit me harder than anything else he could have said. "So while I was sitting in doctors' offices and calling insurance companies, you were already involved with her?" He rubbed his temples. "I didn't know if I was going to survive. Things get complicated when you think you're dying." "And after you lived?" I asked. He exhaled sharply. "After I lived, I realized I didn't want to go back to the life I had." "Our life," I corrected. He didn't argue. I slid the paper toward him. It was a list. Dates, amounts, places. Proof laid out neatly the way I'd always handled things. "You used our money, the money I sacrificed to save you, to build something with her." He glanced at the paper, then pushed it back toward me. "I was going to tell you." "When? After you left?" His silence was answer enough. That night he packed a bag. Not dramatically, no shouting, no slammed doors. He moved quietly, methodically, as if he'd practiced this before. He didn't take much: clothes, toiletries, his laptop. He paused in the doorway once, looking around the room we'd shared for decades. "I never meant to hurt you." I stood by the dresser, my hands resting on the wood to steady myself. "You just didn't care if you did." He flinched at that, but said nothing. Then he was gone. The house felt hollow in his absence, like a shell after the creature has moved on. I sat on the edge of the bed long after the sound of his car faded, staring at the indentation where he'd slept. The next morning, I received an email. It was from Martin. Short, clinical. He wanted a divorce. He wanted to keep things amicable. He wanted to discuss the house. The house. The word made my chest ache. That house held every version of us: newlyweds arguing over paint colors, tired parents rocking a crying baby, middle-aged partners drifting but still tethered. I closed the email without responding. Later that day, I got another message. This one wasn't from him. It was from Claire. I didn't know how she got my email address, but seeing her name in my inbox made my hands tremble. "I'm so sorry for the pain this has caused you," she wrote. "Martin says you already know. I never meant for things to unfold this way." I stared at her words, noticing how carefully chosen they were. Unfold, as if this were a story that happened on its own, not something they actively wrote together. I didn't reply. I spent the next few days in a fog. I went to work. I smiled when required. I came home to a house that echoed with memories and silence. At night, I lay awake replaying everything, wondering how I could have loved someone so completely and known him so little. But beneath the grief, something else was forming: resolve. Martin underestimated one thing. He thought my role in our marriage ended when he walked out the door. He thought my sacrifice was a weakness. He was wrong, because while he was focused on starting over, I was focused on finishing what he started, and I wasn't going to do it with anger. I was going to do it with clarity. There's a moment after betrayal when grief gives way to something sharper. It doesn't announce itself loudly. It arrives quietly, like a door clicking shut behind you. For me, that moment came while I was standing in line at the bank, holding a folder so thick it bent slightly in my hands. I caught my reflection in the glass, tired eyes, set jaw, and realized I was done waiting to be heard again. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to beg. I was going to protect myself. The woman behind the counter knew me by name. I'd been coming there for years, depositing paychecks, asking questions, keeping things in order. "Morning, Mrs. Caldwell," she said kindly. "What can I help you with?" "I need to separate my accounts. Immediately." She didn't ask why. She just nodded and started the process. That afternoon, I called a lawyer. Her name was Denise Harper, and she spoke in the calm, measured tone of someone who had heard every version of heartbreak and learned not to flinch. I told her everything about the surgery, the drained savings, the transfers, the affair. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a pause. "He used marital funds for an extramarital relationship," she said finally. "That matters." Those words settled into me like an anchor. Over the next few weeks, my life became a series of appointments and documents, bank statements, medical bills, emails, dates, and times. Denise taught me to see my marriage not just as a relationship, but as a legal partnership that Martin had violated. "Keep everything," she said. "Receipts, messages, records, details matter." At night, I sorted through boxes in the study, uncovering years of paperwork I'd carefully filed away. I found old birthday cards from Martin, his handwriting looping and affectionate. I found photos of us on vacation, sunburned and smiling. I didn't linger on them. Instead, I built my case. Martin tried to call me. I let it go to voicemail. He sent texts that alternated between apologetic and defensive. "We can do this peacefully. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Claire has nothing to do with the financial stuff." I didn't respond. The first time I saw him after he left was in Denise's office. He looked healthier than I'd seen him in months, color in his cheeks, a confidence in his posture that made something twist inside me. Claire wasn't there, but her absence felt intentional, strategic. "Linda," he said, as if we were meeting for coffee. I nodded once and sat down. Denise laid out the facts calmly: the misuse of funds, the timeline, the expectations. Martin's expression shifted as she spoke, irritation replacing charm. "I was sick. I wasn't thinking clearly." "Yet you managed to transfer money consistently and maintain a relationship," Denise replied evenly. I watched him then, really watched him, and understood something I hadn't before. He wasn't remorseful. He was inconvenienced. The negotiations dragged on for months. He wanted the house, I wanted reimbursement for what I'd spent on his surgery. He wanted to move on quickly, I wanted fairness. In the end, the truth did what it always does. It held. The court recognized the financial misconduct. The house stayed with me. I received a settlement that didn't erase what I'd lost, but it acknowledged it. When the papers were signed, Martin didn't look at me. "I hope you're happy," he muttered. I almost told him the truth, that happiness wasn't the point. Stability was. The public part came later. Word travels in ways you don't expect. Mutual friends reached out with awkward messages. Coworkers offered sympathetic smiles. Even Elise called, her voice shaking as she tried to understand how her parents' marriage had unraveled so completely. "I didn't know," she said. "Dad never said." "I know," I told her gently. "He wouldn't." I didn't badmouth him. I didn't need to. The facts spoke for themselves. At his workplace, things shifted. Rumors surfaced. Policies were reviewed. An affair between coworkers during medical leave raised eyebrows. Questions were asked. Claire transferred departments. Martin stopped returning messages from old friends. One afternoon, months after everything had settled, I ran into him at the grocery store. He looked tired again, not sick, just worn. We stood awkwardly by the produce section, two people who had once planned futures over dinner menus. "Hi," he said. "Hi." He hesitated. I didn't think it would end up like this. I met his eyes. "It ended the way you built it." He nodded, a small, defeated motion, then walked away. That night, I sat alone in the living room, the house quiet but no longer hollow. I realized something had shifted. I wasn't waiting anymore. I wasn't bracing for pain. I was living in the aftermath and finding space to breathe. The strange thing about starting over at my age is that it doesn't feel like rebirth. It feels like excavation. I wasn't creating a new version of myself so much as uncovering the one that had been buried under years of accommodation and compromise. In the weeks after the divorce was finalized, I moved through the house slowly, room by room, deciding what stayed and what went. I donated Martin's clothes to a shelter 2 towns over. I kept one sweater, the gray one he wore when Elise was born, folded it carefully, and placed it in a box I labeled Past. The rest I let go without ceremony. I repainted the bedroom, a soft, warm beige that caught the afternoon light instead of swallowing it. I replaced the heavy curtains with sheer ones that moved gently when the window was open. At night, I slept diagonally across the bed, reclaiming space I hadn't realized I'd surrendered. Healing didn't arrive all at once. Some mornings I woke with a sharp ache in my chest, memories rushing in before my feet hit the floor. Other days I moved through my routine with ease, surprised by the lightness of it. I went back to cooking meals I liked, spicy soups, fresh bread, dishes Martin had always complained were too much effort. I invited friends over, something I'd stopped doing without really noticing. Laughter returned to the house, tentative at first, then fuller. Elise visited in the spring. She stood in the doorway when she arrived, looking around as if she were stepping into a familiar place that had shifted slightly on its axis. "You changed the color," she said. "I needed something new," I replied. We talked late into the night, the way we hadn't in years. She asked questions, not accusatory ones, but careful, searching ones. I answered honestly, without venom. "I don't hate him, but I won't protect his choices." She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I'm proud of you." That mattered more than I expected. Work changed, too. I applied for a senior position I'd never considered before, assuming I wasn't ready or worthy. When I got the offer, I sat in my car and cried, not because of the title, but because I'd finally stopped shrinking myself. Occasionally, I heard updates about Martin through the quiet grapevine of mutual acquaintances. His relationship with Claire didn't last. She moved out of state. He rented an apartment that felt temporary in all the wrong ways. I felt no satisfaction in that, just distance. One evening, months later, I found myself back at St. Vincent's Medical Center, not as a caregiver, not as a wife. I was volunteering now, helping patients navigate paperwork, sitting with those who didn't want to be alone. I met a woman there, older than me, hands trembling as she clutched a folder of bills. "I don't know how I'll pay for this," she whispered. I sat beside her and took her hand. "You'll figure it out," I said softly, one step at a time. As I spoke, I realized I believed it. The final piece of healing came quietly on an ordinary afternoon. I was in the backyard pruning the rose bush Martin and I planted years ago. It had survived neglect, harsh winters, and careless trimming. That year, it bloomed fuller than it ever had. I stood there with dirt under my nails and sunlight on my face and understood something simple and profound. Saving someone else had nearly cost me myself, but choosing myself had saved me in ways no surgery ever could. I don't regret paying for his life. I regret forgetting the value of mine. If you've ever poured everything you had into someone who was already halfway gone, I see you, and I hope you remember this. Recovery doesn't always belong to the person who was sick. Sometimes it belongs to the one who was betrayed. And sometimes the strongest revenge isn't destruction, it's survival with dignity intact. There was one final loose thread I hadn't expected, the quiet reckoning that comes after everyone else thinks the story is finished. It arrived not with drama, but with mail. A plain envelope, my name written in Martin's familiar handwriting, showed up one afternoon nearly a year after the divorce was finalized. I stared at it longer than necessary, feeling that old instinct to brace myself. Then I opened it at the kitchen counter, standing up, grounded. Inside was a single letter. No legal language, no excuses layered in clever phrasing, just words. He wrote about his health, how the surgery had given him time but not clarity, how leaving me had felt like freedom at first, then slowly revealed itself as loneliness dressed up as choice. He wrote about the apartment, about nights that stretched too long, about realizing that being wanted and being loved were not the same thing. "I thought surviving meant starting over," he wrote. "I didn't realize it also meant living with what I'd done." He apologized, not for leaving, but for using my devotion as a bridge to something else, for taking my sacrifice and turning it into an exit. "I don't expect forgiveness," the letter ended. "I just didn't want the rest of my life to be lived without acknowledging the truth." I folded the letter and sat down at the table. A year earlier, this would have undone me. I would have reread it obsessively, searching for hidden meanings, wondering if it was an opening, a regret deep enough to change things. But that day, I felt something different. Completion. I didn't respond, not out of cruelty, but because there was nothing left to say. His understanding was no longer my responsibility. That evening, I met my neighbor Ruth for tea on the porch. She'd watched the entire saga unfold from a respectful distance, offering casseroles when words felt intrusive. "You seem lighter," she said, handing me a cup. "I am. I think I finally stopped carrying what wasn't mine." She smiled knowingly. That's usually the last step. Life didn't transform into something perfect after that. There were still quiet evenings that felt too quiet, still moments, passing couples in hospitals, the smell of antiseptic that tightened my chest unexpectedly. But those moments passed. I filled my days with things that grounded me. Morning walks, volunteering, learning to say no without apology, learning to rest without guilt. One Sunday, I attended a small gathering at Elisa's home. Watching her laugh with her husband, seeing the life she was building, I felt something settle peacefully inside me. She pulled me aside later. "You taught me something," she said. "What's that?" "That love doesn't mean disappearing." I hugged her tightly, the truth of that lesson pressing into me from all sides. As the years stretched forward, I began to understand my story differently. It wasn't about a cheating husband or a surgery or even betrayal, though those were the events that shaped it. It was about what happens when love isn't returned, about how easily loyalty can be mistaken for obligation, and about the quiet power of choosing yourself after you've been chosen against. I used to think revenge meant watching someone regret what they lost. Now I know better. The real reckoning happens when you build a life so full, so steady, that the past no longer asks for attention. When love returns, not from someone else, but from yourself. I never expected peace to come with such quiet grace. After Martin left and the dust of betrayal settled, I spent weeks walking through our house as if I were discovering it for the first time. Each room whispered stories I hadn't realized I had been holding on to. Framed photos of vacations where we laughed until our faces hurt, a set of mugs he always drank from, the faded calendar on the fridge where I had marked birthdays and appointments like tiny promises of stability. The house felt the same and yet entirely different, empty of him, but alive with memory. I began small, reclaiming myself piece by piece. I repainted the walls, soft creams and warm taupes, colors that made the sunlight spill across them like honey in the morning. I sorted the closets, giving away his clothes to charity, keeping only a few items that reminded me not of what I had lost, but of what I had survived. When I tossed his shirts into boxes labeled donation, it was not anger that guided my hands, but a quiet determination. I was building a life free of the weight of deceit. I returned to the routines I had neglected, not to escape my pain, but to ground myself in the ordinary joys I had forgotten. I cooked the meals I loved, ones Martin never appreciated. I brewed strong coffee in the morning and sat by the window with the cat, letting the warmth of the sunlight fill the spaces that had once been shadowed by doubt and disappointment. I took walks in the neighborhood, noting the laughter of children playing, the smell of freshly baked bread drifting from the bakery down the street, the comforting rustle of leaves along the sidewalks. Life, in all its ordinary beauty, returned to me slowly but insistently. Work became my sanctuary. I threw myself into my projects, learning to assert myself in ways I hadn't in years. Where I had once stayed silent to avoid conflict, I now spoke up with clarity, confidence, and poise. I took on leadership roles I had previously considered beyond my reach, and with each success, my confidence grew. Not the hollow pride of superficial triumph, but the deep, steady assurance of someone who had endured and learned. Elise visited that spring. Seeing her walk into the house, now bright with light and warmth, was both painful and comforting. She looked around, a mixture of curiosity and nostalgia on her face. "Mom," she said softly, "the house, it feels like you again." "I needed it to," I replied, smiling gently. "It needed me." We spent hours talking that day, more than we had in years. She asked questions about Martin, about the surgery, about the months I had spent worrying while he was alive and scheming at the same time. I answered honestly, but without bitterness. I told her about my hurt, my heartbreak, and the betrayal, but also about my choices, the ways I had reclaimed my life, my dignity, and my peace. "I don't hate him," I said finally, "but I won't protect his choices. That is no longer my responsibility." Elise nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "I'm proud of you, Mom, proud that you stood up for yourself." That pride, more than any material restitution, more than any court victory, became the first real balm for the years I had sacrificed without reciprocity. Legally, the consequences landed where they were meant to. The court recognized the misuse of funds, the betrayal intertwined with financial misconduct. Martin could no longer claim ignorance. There were records, statements, and timelines that proved the premeditation of his actions. The house remained mine. The settlement covered what I had invested in his surgery and recovery. Justice, at least in this practical sense, was served. Yet I didn't gloat. I didn't seek to humiliate him. Watching him face the consequences quietly, seeing the ripple effects at work and in his social circles, felt almost secondary. The real triumph wasn't in revenge, it was in the reclamation of myself. One afternoon, nearly a year later, a plain envelope arrived in the mail. My name was written in a familiar, looping hand. I knew immediately who it was from. I stared at it a long moment, my fingers hovering, but I didn't tremble. I didn't need to brace myself. I had long since learned that my life no longer required his permission to be intact. Inside was a single letter from Martin. No excuses, no attempts at reconciliation. He wrote about his loneliness, about realizing that freedom does not equal happiness, about the emptiness that followed when he abandoned what truly mattered. He wrote, "I never expected to lose you entirely. I never thought I would realize the value of what I had only after it was gone." I folded the letter carefully. I did not respond. I didn't need to. Its presence was enough. The acknowledgement, the quiet remorse, the truth spoken late didn't change the past, but it confirmed one thing I already knew. I had survived. I had risen. I had chosen myself. Months turned to a year, and my life continued to flourish in ways that had nothing to do with Martin or Claire. I volunteered at the hospital, helping others navigate the confusion and fear I once knew intimately. I reconnected with friends I had neglected. I took long walks and wrote in my journal, capturing thoughts and reflections I once buried in silence. I even began a small book club in the neighborhood, a cozy circle of laughter, tears, and shared stories. One morning, I noticed the rose bush in our backyard, the one Martin and I had planted years ago, had bloomed fuller than ever. I knelt and ran my fingers over the petals, feeling the delicate strength of life itself. "You survived too," I whispered, and I realized finally that the truest lesson of all wasn't about him or the betrayal, it was about me, about survival, resilience, and the quiet power of rebuilding a life on one's own terms. I think about this often when I tell my story. How easily love can be mistaken for obligation, how silently we can give ourselves away, believing devotion is enough to secure another's loyalty. How pain, betrayal, and grief can either destroy us or teach us to walk taller, breathe freer, and live fuller. If you've ever loved someone who didn't return that love, if you've poured everything you had into someone who was already gone, know this: you are not broken. You are awakening. You are reclaiming what was never theirs to take. I want you to hear this clearly. Real strength is not in vengeance, though it may taste satisfying for a moment. Real strength is not in staying silent when your heart is trampled, though it may feel safe. Real strength is in choosing yourself after the betrayal, in honoring your own worth, and in building a life that reflects your value, integrity, and courage. This story, my story, is not just about a husband who betrayed me. It is about the choices we make when we are faced with injustice. It is about how we respond when someone takes for granted the love we freely give. It is about dignity reclaimed, resilience proven, and life rebuilt. And so I leave you with this reflection, the moral that guides me now. Your love should never cost you your peace. Your devotion should never require you to surrender your self-worth. And the greatest act of revenge, or triumph, is not in proving them wrong, but in living right, fully and joyfully, despite what they did. So I ask you, my dear listener, if you were in my place, if you had given everything only to see it used against you, would you have found the courage to reclaim your life? Would you have chosen yourself fully and without apology? Remember this and carry it quietly with you. Survival is not enough. Healing is not enough. Thriving despite the betrayal is the truest proof that you are whole, that you are seen, that you are enough. And when you do step forward into your own life, unburdened, with dignity intact, know this: the world will notice, the past will fade, and your heart will finally rest in the space it has long deserved. Because sometimes the bravest love story we ever live is the one we tell ourselves.